1 week ago, 46-year-old George Floyd died in police custody in Minneapolis after a store clerk made a police call about an alleged counterfeit $20 bill. WisconsinEye wondered, who could we ask to have a honest, if painful, civil dialogue on the events, what happened then, and what may happen in the future. So I'm going to thank two leaders for stepping up to agreeing to do that. State Representative LaKeshia Myers is a Democrat who represents Milwaukee's 12th Assembly District. She is also chair of the legislature's Black Caucus. She was elected to the Assembly in 2018. Jim Palmer is executive director of the Wisconsin Professional Police Association. I want to thank both of you for the courage to come and talk about a difficult time right now. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, my first question is this. Let's begin a week ago. When you saw the photo of the Minneapolis officer kneeling on Mr. Floyd's neck and then learned Mr. Floyd had died, what was your immediate feelings, your reactions? Representative, would you please go first?
My immediate reaction was not again. And I mean, this to me was a public lynching. It was something that was caught on film. It was something that evoked all of the emotion and all of the history that has happened when instances like these have happened before. So immediately, like, really, we're not still doing this. This is still happening. So that was my immediate reaction.
Thank you. Jim, your reaction? You've seen a lot of camera footage, Eric Garner, et cetera. Your immediate feelings and reactions, sir?
Well, my reaction really wasn't all that different from Representative Myers. Like a lot of people throughout the country, felt that video was disgusting, revolting, not representative of the law enforcement in this state. And there's just really no justification for what we see on the video. And our organization generally, we're a little reluctant to comment in most cases on, video accounts of police encounters. And but this one was different. It was a lengthy video, and there really is no justification for the abuse that George Floyd had to suffer.
Well, follow-up question. Are Americans, especially African Americans, are they justified to be angry with police? Jim, go first.
I think they're justified to be angry about a lot of things, and certainly I think law enforcement is one of them. Law enforcement has to do a better job of being responsive and receptive to the voices of disenfranchised communities of color. And we feel as an organization here in Wisconsin, we've made efforts to help address that and improve that dynamic. Having said that, I think we've all been complicit to one degree or another in the death of George Floyd and those like it. And we have to do more with a real serious intent on addressing some of the systemic shortcomings and the systemic bias that we see not only within our criminal justice system, but within our economic system, our educational system, and our healthcare system as well, among others.
Representative Myers, same questions. African Americans have a right to be angry with police, ma'am?
Absolutely. I think going just with what Mr. Palmer said as well, looking at some of the vestiges of how we got here as far as the entire country is concerned. There have been instances of even how police forces were created. If you go back in history and look at the original use of, deputized, people that were deputized by county sheriffs, even during Reconstruction in the post-Reconstruction era, which evolved into actual localized police forces. I think there was a semblance there of, even runaway slave catchers. So when you look at that particular aspect, and as that mentality has evolved, I think you still see semblances of that. Racism is real. I think that it is now important that even white people are saying this and giving voice to it, because I think communities of color have done that repeatedly, and it is easy to silence the voice of a minority and say, oh, well, it could have been something else. It may not have been what it looks like it was. But I think when you have whites that are allies and saying that, no, this was, realistically, you don't put your knee on someone's neck for 8 minutes and 43 seconds. And they're telling you they cannot breathe. They're telling you they're in pain. They're already in handcuffs and have already been, they're not a threat to the officer. So what was the justification for this particular maneuver? So I think when you look at that and understand that, that is why I think a lot of people are waking up and taking the blinders off and saying, no, it's something to this. My mother always says one person may lie on you, but how many thousands and millions and repeated instances of this do we need to see?
So you would agree with a historian, I think I heard on PBS, say that America was founded on a history of violence, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Follow-up question for you, ma'am. Is there any justification, though, for violence when protest turns to violence? And some of those engaging in violence may say they're doing so out of righteous indignation over Mr. Floyd's death. Is there any justification for violence?
I personally don't condone violence. However, I look at, again, looking at it from a historical perspective. And what Dr. King said is that a riot is the cry of the unheard. If that's what gets attention, I think that is something that that is a tactic that has been used throughout history. If you look at even the founding of our country, righteous indignation was the Boston Tea Party. I think when you look at righteous indignation and how, when Crispus Attucks was killed, the first person to be killed in a skirmish setting off the American Revolution, there were individuals who were protesting the British, and they were throwing ice and rocks and glass at loyalists. So that is what set off the founding of our country. And that has been something that has been repeated by multiple ethnic groups and multiple fringe groups, throughout history. So I don't think it's something that's different. But I think that that's something that we've seen in other instances as well.
Well, a protester who then turns into violence and damages property,
right?
Do you think they have any consciousness that they're maybe hurting or damaging their own community?
Can you say the last part? You froze a little bit.
Okay, I'm sorry. Protesters who then end up committing violence, hurting stores.
Okay.
Are they aware that they may be damaging their own community in which they live, ma'am?
I do think some do. I think some understand that. I think there are other layers to that as well. When you look at treatment, as was mentioned during the Sherman Park incident that happened a few years ago, treatment by local businesses in that particular community, where they were so full of emotion that there was a sense to get back at businesses that had been mistreating individuals who their only recourse was to shop there. That was something that I've heard. Now, I will say this and be very transparent, that setting a fire to a Walgreens is not, necessary. And again, looking at it from both sides, I've talked about, the historical aspects of that. But a lot of what we have seen in this particular instance with the protests that have happened recently in the Metro Milwaukee area have been people that did not live in the community. And there have been video footage of people that did not live in these particular communities that were spray painting buildings and, putting the anarchy symbol on the Walgreens and breaking out windows and starting fires. So let's be clear about that as well.
Jim, thanks for your patience. I want to follow up on that. Do you think outsiders, Antifa protesters, radicals from outside communities join some of these peaceful protests in Wisconsin? Their hope to start potentially class wars? Is that a real threat?
I can't speak to their intent, but it does seem clear. I've talked to several officers that have worked various events and worked some of the, the riots, more riotous behavior, if you will, and it seems clear that the groups of individuals that are causing problems, that are causing destruction, are different than the protesters. And the protests, I think, have been overwhelmingly peaceful. I think that's an important thing to note. And there does seem to be a shift in when the sun starts to go down the last several nights in Madison in particular, you have seen a shift in people, a new group of people coming onto the square, for example, coming to the State Street area. As for their intent, I really can't speak to that. I think I consider those that are rioting and those that are protesting in separate lights, because I think that those that are causing destruction, I think it is the only thing that is effectively changing is the subject, and that's not what we should be doing right now. We should stay on subject, and I think going back to Representative Myers' previous point, this situation is different because you have a lot of voices from different communities, black, white, and what have you, that have been speaking in unison about what happened to George Floyd and about the plight of minorities in this country. And I think that is, where we should keep our eye on the ball with regard to that. When you have mass destruction and damage being caused, I don't think that helps advance the dialogue. That's my point of view. But I understand that the sentiments that are out there are palpable, and I hope that another thing I wanted to, before I forget, is that another thing that's different about this instance is that you even have law enforcement groups throughout the country that are overwhelmingly speaking in the same voice. Now, there are some outliers, such as the president of the Minneapolis Police Union, who I think has done nothing but issues incendiary remarks and has not, in my opinion, represented law enforcement or his members well. But for the most part, law enforcement groups and administrators and leaders around the country have acknowledged and been willing to own up to the fact that this was wrong, and we have to correct it.
Follow-up question, Jim. Is it a lot more dangerous for the professional police officers you represent to work these protests? And I'm speaking in terms of the number of incidents I hear about increasingly shots fired. Is it a lot more dangerous than vis-a-vis protests maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago?
Oh, I think so. I mean, obviously, we had not too long ago, although it seems like a long time ago, we had, mass crowds at the Capitol, challenging Governor Walker's collective bargaining attack. And those were peaceful. We didn't have the same, destructive dynamic that we do today. And for the officers that are working these events, it is dangerous. They are largely outnumbered, and it's very delicate. I memean, there is the need for them, obviously, to take some degree of enforcement action. But on the other hand, I think they're mindful of the fact that they don't want to escalate these events any worse.
Right. Representative Myers, did you have a chance to march in some of the protests over the last few days, ma'am?
No, I did not.
You did not. Okay.
I'm very cautious of COVID-19.
I see.
I recently had a kidney transplant a year ago, so I am choosing not to participate in any large-scale events. But I did kneel for 9 with Senator Taylor and Tamika Vukovic, who is a common council member from Glendale. We participated in that on yesterday. So.
Thank you, and I fully understand your desire to protect your personal safety. Jim, what's it like? What are police officers who are working these protests telling you? What is their perspective? Are they scared? They don't know what happens next?
I think first and foremost, to a person, every officer I've spoken to finds this whole event disgraceful, and with regard to the abuse and death of George Floyd. It doesn't represent who they are, and they want someone to say that. And so that's one of the things I've been trying to get out there as an advocate for our law enforcement community. They just think it's disgraceful, not only from a professional law enforcement perspective, but just the actions of those officers in Minneapolis desecrated the basic notions of human decency. And I think that's something that anyone who watches that video in its entirety, and I think people should, you feel that at your core, and I think that's important to share that officers have been impacted by that greatly. It doesn't represent who they are, and it doesn't represent their profession, but it does at the same time. I think it's important to note it represents an experience that's all too familiar for too many Americans. Okay. And that's why we have to address some of these dynamics, and I think it's important to note that while we have a lot of voices saying the same thing, it has to translate into action. And I'm obviously not the first person to say that. When I said earlier that I think we have all been complicit in the death of George Floyd and other tragedies like it to one extent or another, I don't exclude our organization and law enforcement generally from that. I think interest groups, whether you're in law enforcement or business or educational health policy, we have all kind of stick to these silos of interests and operate within those close, narrow confines. And I think for our organization, we're going to have to take a real serious look about getting involved in educational policy and healthcare policy and economic policy, because as we should know, all these are interrelated. And that's not to deflect attention away from the criminal justice system, because I think there are reforms that are needed there as well. But we have to, all these voices and all these sentiments have to translate into some meaningful action.
Representative Myers, here's a blunt question. Are there racist officers like Derek Chauvin in Wisconsin, ma'am?
I would venture to say yes. If you look in any industry or any profession, you will find people who do not represent fully what that profession stands for. And I say that as a person that is an educator by trade and have worked in various different industries. You can never fully say that 100% of any particular profession is devoid of racism or racist individuals.
Would you accept that premise, Jim, that there are unfortunately a few Derek Chauvins in working in Wisconsin police departments?
I think Representative Myers said it best, that there isn't any profession that can stand up on a pedestal and say that they are pure in that regard, in the form of not having any of its members that exercise bias. I think from a law enforcement community standpoint, nobody wants a bad cop out of the profession more than a good cop. And so I think, and our organization has historically long supported measures to increase accountability, to increase transparency in law enforcement actions. And we're going to have to, those efforts are going to have to grow.
Quick follow-up question, Jim. How does police training attempt to disqualify from racist officers? And what training do wannabe police officers get in ethnic and cultural diversity issues? And do they get enough training?
Well, it depends who you talk to with regard to the latter part of your question. There have been gains over the last few years in significant increases in training, not only on implicit bias training for officers, not only coming into the profession, but those currently within it, but also training on de-escalation tactics and how to deal with people that suffer mental illness and things of that nature. Just a few years ago, and our organization supported it, there was a pretty significant increase in the number of hours that law enforcement officers would have to undergo in order to become a part of this profession. And we think having more standards, having more training, those are all good things. And that's good for not only the law enforcement agencies, but the communities they serve.
Representative Myers, the officers involved in the tragic incident in Minneapolis have now been charged. Mr. Chauvin has been charged with third-degree murder. If they're all convicted, including Mr. Former Officer Chauvin of murder, would that be justice, ma'am?
I think.
And how much justice?
I think, no amount of jail time brings back the life of a family member that has been lost. That's number one. But I do think to see this process through and to have a conviction would be justice for the family in some regard. It's the same thing when we deal with, in the city of Milwaukee, with police settlements. That's something that I am, really working hard to try to change that trajectory when we utilize taxpayer dollars to kind of settle these things out of court, and then there's no responsibility taken. So I think those are things that we have to look at as well. And I thank Mr. Palmer for saying that that there is a push to actually do more, because I think that's really necessary, and especially as an aftermath of action from this particular flashpoint.
Jim, if you had a chance to speak to the family of Mr. Floyd, on behalf of Wisconsin's professional police officers, what would you tell them?
I mean, I think first and foremost, we'd have to extend our deepest condolences. I mean, there are no words to bring back George Floyd and return him to his family. I think the other thing that I would say on behalf of law enforcement, if I were generally, and not just in Wisconsin, but we have to do better. As you may have seen this week, George Floyd's daughter, stated that her father changed the world, and I think we have to make sure that is the case, and we all have to be part of that. And I think that's incumbent upon police organizations, police unions, just as much as anyone else. We have to. The best way that I think that we can provide true justice, in addition to whatever accountability the criminal justice system in Minnesota decides is appropriate for those officers, is we have to affect meaningful change.
Thank you. Representative Myers, I fully get the signs, I can't breathe, say his name, but there are two other signs I want to ask you about that the protesters have been holding up. Free prison inmates and defund police. Do you agree with those goals? What would both of those achieve? Help me understand why protesters are holding those signs, ma'am.
I can't speak to specific protesters because I've not talked to them about those movements, but I am familiar with Wisdom and Expo, which is an organization of ex-incarcerated persons who are looking to make some significant changes in the criminal justice system. And this is based solely on my interpretation of those two things. So that's what I'll say first. When you talk about defunding police, I'll be the first person to tell you, if something happens in my neighborhood, who am I going to call first? You're going to call the police. Right. So I do not agree with defunding the police departments totally. What I do agree with is looking at mechanisms that can increase training, increase the number of officers of color, to do community policing, increase the kind of the officer-friendly concept of making sure that the officers that patrol know the individuals that they are interacting with in the neighborhoods that they're coming in contact with. When I talk about defunding in my particular instance, I'm talking about those police settlements of that misconduct that goes, without having a real responsibility paid to them. So that's what I think of when I think of defund police in that particular measurement. When we talk about police that are in schools, there have been studies that have talked about, not necessarily in Wisconsin, but across the country, where the use of resource police officers in schools and how that leads to the school to prison pipeline. So looking at some different measures with that, possibly not having police as present in schools, I understand, is a part of the defund police movement. When it comes to freeing prison inmates, having worked in the Wisconsin correctional system, the first thing that I would think of with freeing prison inmates are looking at people who go to prison, who are revoked to prison on the word of one particular parole officer. That person holds the power to revoke that person and go back to prison. In Milwaukee, we have the Milwaukee Secure Detention Facility that has been overcrowded for many, many years, with low ventilation points, people sleeping on the cots that are in the cells, as well as on the floor in these things called boats. So looking at that and making sure that people are not just housed for a revocation, but actually have the ability to have a trial or have some ability to defend themselves against being revoked to go into prison, because that is a cyclical process where individuals are constantly going back in for maybe minor violations or things that need to be updated within the Department of Corrections. if you are a person that was convicted of child pornography or something like that, and you're coming out of prison and you need to apply for a job, how can you be restricted from using a computer when there are no such things as paper applications? Things like that that need to evolve within the process. That's what I'm looking at with people who say, free prison inmates.
Could I get both of your reaction to a development last night? The Minneapolis School Board last night unanimously voted there'll be no school resource officers in any Minneapolis public schools beginning in the next school year. I wondered if you have an opinion as to whether that's wise. Jim?
I can't speak to that, honestly. That's actually the first time I've heard that. I will tell you that, as you may recall, our organization has annually been conducting a poll through the St. Norbert College Strategic Research Institute on a wide variety of criminal justice issues. And we use that as a platform to try and advance the public discourse on these issues. And we talk about the demographic differences and how minorities feel about law enforcement in relation to whites. And we have asked questions in the past about school resource officers, and generally they are widely supported. And so, taking them out of all the schools in Minneapolis, I think they'll have to be replaced perhaps with something. And maybe that is, I think there'll be a lot of people in the law enforcement community around the country that'll be following that to see, how that, what the impact of that decision is.
Representative Myers, I apologize if you didn't know anything about that. I'm not trying to ambush you, but your reaction to the unanimous vote of the Minneapolis School Board, no SROs?
I actually did read that article, so I'm familiar with it. I'm also looking at it as a breath of fresh air to a certain degree. As I said, I was an educator by trade. So understanding that even in the largest school district in our state, in Milwaukee, we don't have traditional SROs in all of our buildings. The police are called when there are disorderly conduct tickets or, things are happening on campus where they need police support. But Milwaukee Public Schools has always maintained its own safety department, and they are not armed. They, have been able to control different situations that may arise if there's a fight or something like that at school. They've always had, if it's severe enough, contact local law enforcement, but they are not located in most of the schools that we have in our city. However, I also represent a portion of Wauwatosa. Wauwatosa has SROs in their building. So I think it's a school district by school district decision. I think the needs are different. I think that the threat levels are different in being honest, in a lot of our suburban districts where you think about people wanting to protect their children from school shootings. That is more likely to happen in a suburban-esque district than it does happen in urban areas. And that is not my opinion. That is, statistics that have happened with a lot of the school shootings that we've seen across the nation.
Okay, I want to respect. Yeah, go ahead, Jim, please.
No, if I could add, having had a few seconds to think about that question a little bit more, I think whether it's through an independent school district safety agency or having SROs within the school from the local police department, I think there is value in having men and women, officers who have training that is specific to working in a school environment, who have relationships with the kids, who understand the school facilities. I think there are benefits to having school resource officers, and I know there have been efforts by the state Department of Justice here to make the training and educational standards for school resource officers more uniform, and I think there is value to it.
I want to respect your time. I just have a couple more questions. Yesterday, Governor Evers he asked the legislature to pass AB 1012, which would require the police standard boards to set a new standard determining that lethal force by law enforcement officers is only a last resort, that officers would do all they could to avoid it, and that officers would stop fellow officers who they felt were engaging in lethal or unreasonable force. The governor has called for passage of 1012. It's not got a public hearing. The legislature is adjourned. Do you support that, Representative Myers?
I do. I think that this is a first step among many of resurrecting some of the legislation that has been talked about or discussed, by people on both sides of the aisle as far as what we can do to make sure that we're holding officers more accountable. This is an accountability measure and something that I think would provide the ability for people to be held responsible for what they do. This should be a last resort. Lethal force should always be a last resort. The other part of that is I think it also provides a bit of comfort to officers who are the good guys that may be looking at other officers and afraid to say something when they know your partner has done something wrong. I think that's a part of the issue as far as culturally in a lot of police departments. And Mr. Palmer, I'm sure can speak to this more than I can, but looking at it, you don't want to be looked at as a whistleblower in certain instances in police departments. So there has to be some mechanism where people can have protections against them. It's not like you're going against the team. I think a lot of times people looking like, oh, this person is a snitch, or they're going against the team when they tell what another officer has done. This is something that's a cultural nuance in a lot of different areas. And I think people are afraid to speak up and say something. And I think AB 1012 is something that will be able to kind of alleviate that, along with other things. There have been bills that have sat on the shelf, even this last legislative cycle. Senator Taylor and Representative Thiesfeld and I worked on the sexual assault by a police officer bill that had bipartisan support, but was not brought to the floor of the Senate, and it died there. So I think these are things that we have worked on and are continuing to champion, but may have fallen on deaf ears from some of our colleagues.
Thank you. Mr. Palmer, your reaction to the governor's call to pass AB 1012, sir?
We're not averse to it. I think it's important to note, to be accurate, that every one of the principles that bill would require is already well represented in Wisconsin, whether through statute, the administrative code, or the curriculum, the educational and training curriculum for officers in the state. Now, I think it's a valid topic of discussion from a public policy perspective as to whether or not those provisions should be codified. So we're not averse to that legislation by any measure. I think they're already well represented. If we can use the discussion surrounding that legislation as a launching pad to discuss other measures, not only those within the criminal justice system, but outside of it as well, I think that could be a constructive first step.
Thank you. Here's my final question. We've all had 8 days to absorb what happened in Minneapolis with Mr. Floyd. My final question is, I want to ask both of you for any sign of hope you've seen in the last 8 days. Jim, you want to go first?
Sure, I drew the short straw, I guess. I would say that, one sign of hope is, for me, and I mentioned this earlier, is that you have law enforcement coming out and publicly stating in a way that we've never seen before that this was wrong. And, so that gives me hope. That is a distinction that is distinct from other instances like this that have occurred around the country. As I mentioned, now it has to translate into action and meaningful action. And, like I said, for our part as an organization, we consider ourselves pretty progressive as a law enforcement group. But I think we still need to do more. To kind of break out of the narrow silos in which we've been operating and recognize that, the systemic bias that we see in our state and in our country is it's interrelated to a lot of issues, and oftentimes officers have to respond to cases and calls that really are a product of disabilities elsewhere in the system, and those need to be addressed as well.
Thank you. And I'll give the chair of the Black Caucus the last word. Ma'am, hope.
I do think there have been many glimmers of hope that we can see coming from this. Again, I want to point out that a lot of the protesters have been multi-ethnic. There have been people that come from all walks of life to recognize and to give voice to something that in my particular community has been voiced for a very, very long time, multiple generations, centuries even, to say that this was an issue. It is just refreshing to see that it is now receiving the traction that it has received, so that hopefully there can be greater movement, with the as to progress with that. I think also with looking at some of the officers taking a knee and in some places joining the protest with those marchers, I think that says a lot. I think that is a good show of support, but we have to, again, push further and push for more and push for policy changes that effectuate change. I think it was something important to have the president of the Common Council in the city of Milwaukee basically call out the mayor and say that we need to make sure that we have a full fire and police commission. There have been individuals that are on the fire and police commission that have overstayed their term. And we have state legislation that dictates that we have a 9-member commission. It is set at 7 members for over a decade, and we want to know why. I think that this is kind of a cause that can mobilize people in different municipalities across the state to, in effect, start their own fire and police commissions to have public review of officer misconduct and make sure that we start to draft legislation that talks about making sure that we talk about mandatory diversity and inclusion, having more hours of diversity and inclusion training, what that training looks like, and also discussing the fact that we want to end police settlements that, alleviate responsibility from departments. I think this is something that is a necessity and something that can be a positive push in the actionable parts of the movement.
Thank you so much for a very honest conversation. I want to thank State Representative LaKeshia Myers, Milwaukee Democrat who represents the 12th District. She is also chair of the Legislative Black Caucus, and Jim Palmer, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Professional Police Association. Let's close with, let's remember what Dr. Martin Luther King said. Let us realize the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Representative Myers, Mr. Palmer, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm John Henkes, President of WisconsinEye Public Affairs Network, and I'm speaking to you today to ask for your financial support. For 14 years, WisconsinEye has provided uninterrupted, gavel-to-gavel live coverage from our state capitol, the legislature, the Supreme Court, the governor's office. We're proud to continue to do that and continue through this time of crisis with important coverage. We are 100% committed to bringing these important meetings into your home or place of work. We've created online pathways that allow us to connect you live with these important events. But WisconsinEye needs your help to do so. At this time, we are facing unprecedented staffing, technical, and financial challenge. So if you rely on our coverage to stay informed on issues you care and need to know about, I ask that you consider a one-time charitable gift today to help us through this challenge. Whether you're following the DHS briefings, the Wisconsin Elections Commission, or leadership briefings from the state capitol, or any of the timely interviews conducted by our senior producer, Steve Walters, we could use your support today. If just a fraction of the thousands who value WisconsinEye coverage say yes with a gift of any size, it will provide a huge boost. So thank you. To donate, please visit wiseye.org/donate. That's WISEYE.org/donate. Or send a check to WisconsinEye, 122 West Washington Avenue, Suite 200, Madison, Wisconsin, 53703. Again, thank you so much. Please be safe. Stay optimistic. We are Wisconsin.